Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1000 for April 16th, 2023. It's a milestone episode, and we're going to do something we've only done once before. I've gone back into the archives and picked some memorable interviews and moments from the past 18 years. We'll have some of the highlights from those interviews on WhiskyCast in depth. I'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, our community segment, Behind the Label, and much more. The news is next on this special edition of WhiskyCast.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Small batch. How would you describe it? It's like an Irishman's understanding of baseball. Extremely limited.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Hey friends, Gabriel Cardarella here again with Dewar's Scotch Whisky, and I have to say, Dewar's French Cask Smooth is a double-aged masterpiece, finished in apple brandy cask from Normandy to be unlike anything you've tried before. More in a bit.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. Scotch Whisky Association leaders are not happy with British Chancellor Jeremy Hunt. As we reported last month, Hunt plans to raise excise duties on whiskies and other distilled spirits by 10.1% on August 1st. Now the SWA has launched its Keep the Commitment campaign to put pressure on Hunt to rethink the tax hike. The commitment refers to the government's pledge in 2019 to make sure the tax system supports Scotch whisky. Parliament is scheduled to vote on the tax hike next week, and the SWA says a no vote would send a clear message to the Chancellor to reconsider his stance toward the industry. The backlash from the barrel tax phase-out in Kentucky didn't take long. Nelson County officials took the first step Friday in what could be a moratorium on new bourbon rickhouses and other distillery construction. Why is that critical? Well, Bardstown is the county seat of Nelson County, and millions of dollars in new construction projects are already underway or in the planning stages. The 90-day moratorium on new projects would give local officials a chance to review current ordinances that affect the bourbon industry, with an eye to protecting prime agricultural land and public health. Nelson County Judge Executive Tim Hutchins told the Lexington Herald-Leader that, quote, "I didn't get elected by the distilleries or big business. I got elected by the citizens of Nelson County." In addition, Bullitt County officials won't consider any new bourbon-related construction unless the industry agrees to bear costs associated with their projects. 3 new rickhouse projects have already been approved, but Judge Executive Jerry Summers says nobody in the county has an appetite for them now. Point of irony here, Summers is a retired Beam Suntory executive and a member of the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Last week, I reported on a rare collection of American whiskies going on the auction block at Sotheby's in London. The 5-bottle prototype collection is the only survivor of a shelved United Distillers project from 1997 that would have featured whiskies from closed American distilleries. The collection hit the auction block Friday, and 3 bidders kept outbidding each other until the hammer finally came down at $187,000. That set a record for American whiskies at Sotheby's. The overall high bid from Friday's auction was for a McEwan and Lalique 6 Pillars collection, which sold for $624,000. In other news, 7 years ago, Father Jim Sitchko made worldwide news when he presented Pope Francis with a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle bourbon. The Kentucky priest and papal missionary has kept the Pope's bar well stocked on his visits to the Vatican ever since. But now there's a papal private barrel pick from Willett available for sale. Now, the Pope didn't pick it, but it bears his official seal, and Sitchko says the 10-year-old bourbon celebrates Francis's 10th anniversary as Pope.
I've always been impressed with Willett, and the reason being is, to be honest with you, is I just love that crest out there. And I was like, it would be neat if I could get one of these bottles and be able to put the crest of the Holy Father, which you see there, on it, and be able to provide it to him. Well, I kept I mean, people would just kind of blow me off. I never called the distillery itself. You know what I mean? I would try to talk to people that I knew had some connections in the bourbon world, but they were like, it's impossible. It's not going to be able to be done, especially something like a Willett or a Van Winkle. And so finally, I just had enough, and I called Julian Van Winkle. And I told him, look, can you help me out here? I gave your bourbon 7 years ago to the Pope. Can you just help me contact someone at Willett and see if they would do that? The next day, Drew Kulfstein calls the master distiller at Willett and says, why didn't you call me? And I said, I don't even know who you are. And he said, come on down and let's have a barrel tasting.
Only 125 bottles will be available through an online auction and raffle, with a few bottles available through Ernie's Spirits in Lexington, Kentucky. Bottles number 1 and 2 are headed for the Vatican next month. One is for the Pope, and Father Sitchko hopes to have him sign the second bottle. The coronation of King Charles III is set for May 6th, and he'll be honored with a special release of Royal Salute. The Chivas Brothers blend was originally created in 1953 to honor Queen Elizabeth's coronation, and master blender Sandy Hislop used 53 different whiskeys to create the coronation blend. Only 500 bottles will be available in global travel retail at a price of $25,000 each. Jura has unveiled a new addition to its Cask Edition series of single malts. Jura Pale Ale Cask Edition is a collaboration with local craft brewers and is the 4th release in the series. It's available at Tesco and other UK retailers with a recommended retail price of £35 a bottle. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Paterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from WhiskyCast.
Time now to take a look at some of the upcoming whiskey events taking place around the world. First off, the Kentucky Bourbon Festival is not until September, but word came this week that tickets will go on sale May 11th through the festival's website. This coming weekend is a busy one with the Nth Universal Whiskey Experience in Las Vegas, the Hong Kong Whiskey Festival, the Limburg Whiskey Fair in Germany, and the Texas Whiskey Festival in Austin, just to name a few. The Spirit of Speyside Festival kicks off April 26th and runs through May 1st. In Australia, Whisky Live Melbourne is on April 28th and 29th, with the Whisky Show in Perth on the 29th. The Spirit of Toronto is on May 6th, followed by Whisky Fest Chicago on May 12th, and the London Whisky Weekender from the 12th through the 14th. If you're organizing a whiskey event, please let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendar at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Gabriel here again. Dewar's Master Blender Stephanie McLeod has been doing some amazing things with cask finishing lately, and Dewar's French Cask Smooth is no exception. It's the 5th addition to the Dewar's Cask Finishing series. This 8-year whiskey is double-aged, then finished in Calvados casks to blend together the best of Scottish distilling and aging with the finest in French brandy maturation. The nose is sweet honey and citrus in perfect balance. Taste it, and you'll get this unmistakable note of baked apple, citrus, and a hint of cinnamon spice. Now, I recommend it this time of year as an apple cinnamon highball, using lemon juice, simple syrup, unfiltered apple juice, and club soda, or simply enjoy it on its own. Either way, it's a specially crafted reward for your curiosity.
WhiskyCast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock and the Classic Malts lineup. The other day, a listener asked me in the WhiskyCast community app whether I thought years ago that we'd hit episode number 1000. My answer was simple: never. After all, it's taken almost 18 years to get to this point. We've only done one best of episode before, episode 100, and there's been a lot to talk about since then, So, for this special episode, I thought it might be fun to go back into the archives and pick some memorable moments and people from the past 18 years. Now, when you ask a distiller what his or her favorite whiskey is, they'll usually tell you it's like trying to pick a favorite child. Just about impossible. And that's the case here. What I tried to do with this week's show is pick some of the moments that stand out. For instance, my trip to the Gordon and MacPhail warehouse in Elgin, Scotland with Michael Urquhart for episode 249 in April of 2010.
Tell me about your first experience with single malts when you were growing up. At what point did your father let you start tasting?
I've always family businesses. The family always get involved in working the business, and from an early age, I was working in the business, whether making up orders in the retail, our grocery side or the wine and spirit side. Even before that, we used to wholesale confectionery, because back in those days there was a lot of small independent shops around the countryside. Supermarkets were unknown in those days. And I remember as a 6, 7, 8-year-old going out with a guy who still works for us, who used to drive a van and go around the stores and go and sell confectionery to them. And that was my first memory of working in the business. But all through the time, you'd work in the various parts, including the bottling hall, where obviously you'd see the casks of whiskey being emptied and nosing them and so forth. So it's kind of evolved over the years. But some people say your palate is, until you get into your 20s, mid-20s, late 20s, your palate is not mature enough to go and taste brown spirit. That could be brandy, cognac, rums, or whatever. It's just too intense a taste for your palate. Whether that's right or wrong, I'm not sure. I've never consciously taken a note of that was the first single malt whiskey that you tried. It's just been an evolution, but certainly that it's interesting with my own kids and getting them to go and try single malts, how they've kind of developed their palate. And the youngest one's now 21, and she enjoys a single malt Scotch whisky as well, as do the rest of them, especially if Dad's paying.
And you made them start out in the bottom ends of the business too, right?
Yeah, they've all worked in various parts of the business, but they've quite a wide variety of experience. One's got a first-class honours in textile design, so she works as a buyer for ladies' wear for a chain of shops. One's a doctor, working down in a hospital in London. One did a degree in film and television and is working in a film production company, and one's just about to finish a degree in theatre and drama studies, specialising in arts journalism. So a wide variety, and that's one thing that my brothers and sister and I have all said to our kids is, go and do what you want to do. There's no compulsion to come back to the family business. But if you do want to come back, then you'll go through a due process. And one of the things is that they'll go and work in every part of the business, from making spirit to bottling whiskey to serving in the delicatessen shop and cutting bacon and ham and so forth, to going out and visiting customers either in the UK or abroad, and also the administration, because it's important they understand what the whole business is about, because if they only think about one part, then they're missing the other parts. And we are quite a complicated business, but a great business to be in. And we've got a great team of managers who help us run the business and also train this next generation up. So it's great to get that support. And at the end of the day, they finish one chapter and go into the next chapter of their apprenticeship. And one jokingly was asked the question, when do you finish your apprenticeship? And he said, my uncle told me it's a week before I retire. But that's what life's about. You're always learning. And it's important to kind of keep your mind open to change and how you adapt to change to help the business and indeed what we do kind of keep on going forward. Whereas if you're always thinking within a box, then you will always operate within that box and not go out with. So it's important to go and keep your mindset open to everything.
Well, thank you for letting me into your sample room today.
Before we go, Mark, we've got one other one that I want you to go and try. This is a youngster. It was just launched in Edinburgh.
Lord.
Castle. This is the Mortley 70-year-old, 46.1%. first full sherry cask. You may have seen the cask as you came in the front door as we came into the offices.
In fact, I did see the cask, and I'm going to, I even shot a picture of it while you were running upstairs to get keys. And before I try this, I would like to get a little glass of water and clear my palate. Only because that first fill sherry from the Strathisla is rather intense, and I want to give this the credit it duly deserves. The color on that is amazing. It's just a rich oak color is the best way to describe it. Almost like if you could see grain in it, you would see it would look like an oak, like a piece of oak.
Yeah, Charlie McLean from Edinburgh, the whiskey writer, he described it as like a desk from your grandfather's time that's been sitting in the sun and just getting a light bleaching coming through, kind of a lightly bleached mahogany desk.
As a matter of fact, I just placed that with your description. It reminds me of the wood in my grandfather's old leather chair that I got after he passed on, and it sits in my house right now. It reminds me exactly of that wood color. And this is it, correct?
Yeah. So 70 years in the same cask, matured at Mortlach Distillery from October 1938 up to 1982, and then moved to our warehouses here in Elgin. So it's travelled far.
And let's look at back in 1938. We were just about to start World War II. Single malts were not widely sold at all, and it was primarily blends. And this cask was just set down at the time that it would have obviously at some point been thought of that this was going to be for blending purposes, right?
Well, yeah, it was Mortlach at that time would have been part of SMD, which is part of United Distillers, and so it's evolved. The main constituent, or the heart of Johnny Walker Black Label, but it's a lot of the production will go into blend. But Mortlach's been a distillery that we've filled from each year, going back to my grandfather's time, or virtually every year. Just a beautiful, rich Speyside whiskey, very elegant and spicy.
And to put this into perspective, this was put into cask 2 years before my father was born. So this whiskey is, while not twice as old as I am, it is an amazingly old whiskey, and yet it still has great legs, great color, and when I nose it, you're right about the vibrancy on that. That does not smell like 70 years old. It is not over-oaked in the least bit. 70
years young.
As you described it earlier.
Yeah. My brother David, who's also joined MD, he made the comment, he said, I hope I feel as full of life as this whiskey is when he's 70 years old, to which his wife was kind of looking at him a mild panic. But it's really great. And the launch of the generations at Edinburgh Castle, we were looking to go and make a statement, and we were lucky. It was a beautiful sunny day. Bit of a chilly wind, but beautiful sunny day, bright day. We had some of the fourth generation involved in it as well. In fact, one of my daughters, Claire, carried in the decanter into the Queen Anne room with two soldiers from the Royal Regiment of Scotland as escorts either side. And the photographs that were taken, there was, in fact, the staff at Edinburgh Castle said they hadn't seen so many photographers at a press launch since Sean Connery received the freedom of the city of Edinburgh. So there was, obviously it was a quiet news day, thankfully. And the images went round the world. In 12 hours, I did a quick search on the web, and I think it was in about 50 to 70 websites. Within 24 hours, it was up to 200. And I think if you go and type in Mortlach 70-year-old into Google, it's, last time I checked, it comes up with about 7,000 to 8,000 different hits. So it's captured the imagination, and the photographs of Claire with this decanter and one or two of the soldiers has been propelled worldwide. I think that if it had been David or I that had been carrying in the decanter, we might have made it into the front page of the local paper, but that would have been it. So,
and Claire instantly became very popular.
Well, yeah. One of the images that we got was from our customer in Taiwan that had picked it up in a Taiwanese paper. She got this paper, it's all in Chinese, and then the picture of Claire up in the top right-hand corner. So totally surreal to go and see how the web helps go and disseminate this information around about the world. 70 years ago, you'd have been hard-pressed to come get this story out with Speyside. But now, it just shows how small the world is.
That 70-year-old Mortlach remains one of just 8 whiskies that I've given my highest score ever, 98 points. 2010 turned out to be a pretty good year. In October, I was given the chance to tour the Chivas Brothers Blending Lab in Kilmallock, Scotland, with Chief Blender Sandy Hislop. At the time, no other journalist had ever been allowed in the lab, and he put me through the same nosing tests all of his blenders take on an annual basis.
Now, we have moved from the blending lab into the room next door, and this is the room I'm most nervous about after nosing whiskeys for the last hour or so. It's test time, right?
Absolutely. This is the annual assessment that everyone has to sit at Chivas Brothers who is nosing whisky, and that includes myself, have to pass this test every year to operate and be able to go out and assess whisky.
How does it work?
We have a set of 10 samples, and you have one control. You nose that control, and all you have to do is run along those 10 samples and say, are they the same or are they different? If you're not happy with it, you shove it back and reject it. The idea is only to reject the whiskies that are bad in the set of 10.
This should be fun.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to have a sit down in the booth, take your control sample. Any samples you're unhappy with, push them back. Any ones you're okay with, keep them forward. It's as simple as that. But remember, it's just as bad to reject something that's okay as to not reject something that's bad.
Now, what am I nosing for here? Is there a specific profile I'm looking for?
What you have here is a malt whisky, and you're just nosing it against cask samples, so it would be anything that would have a cask defect. Something that may be a little bit sour, something that may be a little bit musty. Just work your way along and have a look at them and see what you think. Not specifically asking for you to give me descriptors for each one, simply a difference test at this point. Tell me if you're getting a difference or not.
I don't even want to know what a passing score on this will be. Okay.
I'll be back in 2 seconds.
And since it is a little hollow in here because it is actually a wooden booth, I'm going to take a quick pause here, and we'll come back and pick this up in a minute. I'm not going to inflict my attempt to pull this off on you, so sit tight and I'll be right back. And we're back, and I've gone through 7 of the samples so far, and 2 of them are obvious rejects as far as I know. And as Sandy has said, basically this is the test that is the first line of defense, correct?
Absolutely. We're not looking to trick anyone with these tests. We're looking to just be absolutely sure that people can get the flavours that we're looking to be eliminated from the blends.
I'm on number 8 now, and so far 1, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8 smell okay. There's only 2 that I've rejected. One was just really nasty, and the other had a little bit of a rubbery note to it, I think. Ooh, that one is sulfury. That's a sulfured cask. That number 9, that was just nasty. And
yeah, well done. You're absolutely spot on. That is exactly what that is. It's sulphur and something that we would not be looking to be included in the blend.
And number 10 smells about right. So it looks like 2, 5, and 9 are the ones I picked out as the bad ones.
Yeah.
And the other ones, while there are some differences in the casks, they're not enough to be. Some were a little bit less on the flavor than others, but there wasn't anything wrong with any of them. How'd I do?
Yeah, absolutely superb. And just to prove that we're not doing any trickery here or anything, I'll give you the results.
Okay.
So you can go to top of the class.
2, 5, and 9. Sour, number 5 was musty, and I just want to get that note again in my nose because that was a tricky one. And what was number 9 was the sulfur.
Not just sulfur, extreme sulfur.
Now I know there are some folks who like sulfury whiskeys, but they wouldn't have even liked that one. Yeah, that's okay because it smelled like my laundry room at times.
Yeah, well, that's good because it's like that sort of stale water washing machine. For me, it's like just like a bucket of water that's been lying in the garden. You just get that musty flavour coming through. So, absolutely well done. You can rest easy. Even after nosing 20 samples, you are still able to pick out the samples. So, if you like to move on to test number 2, that's you done the mature test. Now I'd like you to do the new distillate test. So this is at our grain distillery in Strathclyde. This is the distillery control room operators would be testing these samples.
Okay, so I'm going to move the chairs around just a little bit here. And a sip of water. And once again, in the interest of expediency and not boring you to tears, I will come back in just a minute. And I'm back again. Just went through the 10 samples of grain, picked 3 out, and we learned a very important lesson before I started recording here again about the importance of going back to the control sample, right?
Yeah, the control sample sets your nose. Use it all the time. Use it for every sample. Don't just run along the samples, because if there is a slight difference, you'll get knocked off track. Always go back to your reference. Keep yourself going. So how do you think you did there?
Well, I want to go back on this for a second, because number 9, I went straight from 8 to 9 without doing the control, and I thought number 9 showed a citrusy note, and that's when you told me to go back and do the correct note. On this one, 3, 6, and 10 are the ones that I set aside as off for some reason.
Great. Number 3 for me has a slight beefy note to it, and is not what I would be looking for. It's not reject, but needs to be used carefully, and I would be asking the distillery to go back and look at that and make sure it's right. Sample number 6 is not Strathclyde, it's another grain whisky, so you did very well there. Sample number 10, you need to watch this in the process. If your maltster that's supplying your malt to you, or your grain supplier supplying your grain for, you need to watch that there's no peat managed to sneak into the process. Number 10 has a bit of peat, but yet again, full marks. How good are you?
The personalities of whiskey can often be larger than life, yet come in an unassuming package. Take, for example, the late great whiskey writer Michael Jackson, to whom all of us who write or talk about whiskey owe a debt. His early books on whiskey helped give the field of whiskey writing legitimacy. I only had one interview with Michael in March of 2007, shortly after he disclosed that he was suffering from Parkinson's disease.
I think I'm doing pretty well. I've had Parkinson's for at least 10 years, possibly even might be even nearer 20 years. And it was diagnosed for sure 10 years ago. And in the last 10 years, I've probably worked as hard or harder than ever. Writing books and travelling around the world and doing public appearances and so forth, to tastings and things. With Parkinson's, the medication they give you tends to work well for 8 or 9 or 10 years, and it starts to lose its grip a little bit. So they've been trying other stuff with me, and when they're trying this other stuff, it's sometimes you're having different dosages and playing around with it a bit, and the problems of Parkinson's become a bit more evident, and that was really why I had to go public with it. People say, "How are you doing?" And I say, "Well, I'm rocking and rolling," and I'm rocking and rolling a bit, but I'm out there working and working hard, and I intend to carry on working hard.
Now, what are you working on these days? You just came out with the big whiskey book a year or so ago. What are you working on now in terms of writing?
I've just been. I'm in the midst of a beer book at the moment. It's a beer book with a cast of thousands, a bit like the big whiskey book, where I use other writers working with me, and I'm in the midst of that right now. Then I'll be looking at whether it's about time to update the single malts book. I also have a book that I'm very, very pleased about, but it's only available in Italian, and that's for some years I've been writing a lot of quite new work for me, new things, new areas for this slow food movement in Italy, and they asked if they could put together an anthology of a lot of the pieces I've written for them, and they pepped it up as well with some pieces I've written for other magazine. So they call this book, they call it Beer, Whiskey and Life, Stories by Michael Jackson. And it was published earlier this year late last year in Italian. And I'm now looking for an English language publisher for it, and I haven't really had that much time to pursue this. So, right now, I haven't got an English language publisher for it, but I hope we will, because it's got quite a lot of quite personal stuff in it. A lot of memoir stuff, stories about my family, some fictionalized stuff, some short stories. It gives another view of me and my writing.
You mentioned the update on the single malt Scotch book, on the guide.
The thing like the single malts book is that the publishers won't commit to a regular frequency. I mean, they want to update it frequently, but they won't commit to what that frequency should be. It tends to sort of 2 or 3 years or 3 or 4 years. If they would commit to saying how often and when they would update it, would make my life easier. But they always want to see how one edition sells before moving on to another. And it's complicated also by the fact that there are lots of foreign language editions of that book, and the foreign language publishers have their own different agendas about when they want to publish. So I just have to go with the flow.
Is there a timeline for publishing this one yet, or is that still up in the air?
As to when we'll do the next edition of the single malts book, that's really the next thing on the agenda to discuss is when we shall do the next edition of single malts. I'm at the moment travelling quite a bit in the US, and I've got some travel to do in Finland, and we've got to finish my beer book. When we've done that, we'll sit down and have some hard talking about when to do the next edition of single malts.
Last question. Of all the whiskeys you've tasted over the years, when it comes down a few years from now, this is a question I routinely ask distillers, and I'll ask you the same one. When it comes down to that last final dram, any idea which one, if you had to pick them all, out of all of them, which one you'd pick for that final dram?
People, of course, ask me about what's your favourite malt or what's your favourite whiskey, and I say, it depends on where I am in the world and what mood I'm in and all the rest of it, which is true. So then they say things like, okay, you're before a firing squad. But instead of saying cigarette, they say whiskey. Which one are you going to choose? I'm not sure even that's a very good measure, because it would be one that would anaesthetise myself for the firing squad, but it would also be a question of my own feelings change about these things, and I have there'll be a time when I have a particular crush on one distillery, perhaps, and in recent years I've been very fond of Ardbeg, and if something comes out from Ardbeg that has a particularly good smoky character, then I'll very often say, that's my favourite this week. You have to wait until the time comes.
Sadly, Michael Jackson died 5 months later of complications from Parkinson's. Parker Beam was another larger-than-life figure taken from us far too early. He died from ALS in January of 2017. The Bourbon Hall of Fame master distiller for Heaven Hill really defined the term master distiller. He was one of the guests on the very first episode of WhiskyCast in November of 2005. In October of 2009, he celebrated 50 years at Heaven Hill, and we sat down for an interview at the party.
Tell me about what you were thinking last night as everybody was gathered in Bardstown to honor you.
Well, I thought it was a little overwhelming. It's been one of those things that master distillers were always this taught to produce a good product, and this the day-to-day recognition you didn't really get, but as the premiums have come into play, and the single barrels and small batches, the recognition has really come about. So when it gets back to my, I really appreciate that your efforts are very rewarded through events like that. And like I said, making 50 years with the same company, and there's the same ownership is probably the most unique thing that most master distillers haven't got to experience, but I have.
Tell me about growing up in a bourbon family when you were young. Did you ever have any choice but to go into the bourbon business?
Probably not. You were always destined to kind of knew, that's where you was probably going to wind up, although, you had to have some other thoughts that maybe I'd like to do this, maybe I'd like to do that. But the bottom line was you always knew you was going to get back to your roots, and that's the way it all worked out. I was around the operation at Heaven Hill ever since I was about 3 or 4 years old, following Dad around. So it's been sort of, every family get together and with uncles and cousins and all that. The main topic of conversation was going to be bourbon and making bourbon and drinking bourbon. So, it's probably one of those things you were destined to do if you'd been some kind of alien, probably,
Tell me about your first taste of bourbon. How old were you when you got your first sip?
Oh,
And did you like it?
Not necessarily so, probably. I've forgotten now the age. I think we all probably started on some lighter alcoholic beverages like wines and beers but probably 16, 17 years old. Somewhere in that range.
What was it like working with your dad?
Oh, it's a very unique experience that not too many master distillers get that privilege. And it was trying at times, but he put you through all the steps that he thought would make you into a good master distiller. And he also prided himself in his teachings that his father taught him and had been passed down. So I think he thought it was very rewarding if he could make me into a distiller, although we didn't always agree. And I thought, well, maybe that's not necessary. Maybe we can eliminate a few steps here and there and speed up the process. But you really come to find out that his knowledge and what he'd been taught, that's the way it has to be.
And that's what you've passed on to your son,
right.
Craig.
Right. I've tried to pass that on and tell him that as you go through with the everyday production, there's no shortcuts. It all has to be done the way we've been taught and the way that really produces the quality products that we've been able to produce over the years. There's definitely no shortcuts.
Tell me about the high points and the low points of your 50 years. I'm assuming, and tell me if I'm wrong, that there had to be some pretty low points back in the 70s and early 80s when there was a lot of people that weren't sure that the bourbon industry was going to make it the way it was.
Right. We didn't produce a lot during those periods, early 70s and all the way through the early 80s. For about a decade, it was kind of nip and tuck, and we didn't really have a lot of inventory, and we didn't put a lot in the inventory. because, like you said there, it was kind of iffy. And then, when the thing took off, when they started putting a lot of marketing behind Evan Williams, that was, of course, is our flagship bourbon. And that thing really kind of, in the late 80s, really started to take off. And we were caught a little short then. And then the biggest challenge that I said I faced at that time was to try to up the production and meet the production needs we need that met at that time, and still maintain the quality. And that was sometimes when you try to do that, your quality can slip. So that's sort of one of the biggest challenges I can see in my 50 years is how to grow the volumes and maintain the quality all and that in the same process.
I guess one of the other low points had to be the fire in '96.
Right.
Because it's the distillery where you grew up around. What were you thinking that night when you heard about the fire?
Well, it was quite a shock. I couldn't, I didn't sleep for a number of days, and we had a lot of memories and a lot of things that, took place. I figured couldn't be replaced, but I figured that with the know-how we all had, and we could put together the same product even if we had to go someplace else, we would be able to duplicate that very well, even if we weren't going to build back there. We've been able to come and put those products back on the shelf just like we always did and never miss a heartbeat.
Let's talk about the high points. What were the high points for you in the 50 years?
I guess the high points were that you got the recognition out of the product you'd been producing over the years. I guess that was one of the most rewarding times in my life when we started getting awards for our different products, and people really recognize the true traits of the master distiller, that the product is his, all his. And that's what he's produced, so it made it very rewarding for me when we got the accolades and awards over the years. And as I told Max Shapiro, we were talking, he said, "Boy, that's fantastic, Parker, that we're getting this." I said, "I always knew we had the kind of products, but now it's very rewarding to know people agree with you."
What does it take to make a good bourbon? What, in your mind, is a good bourbon?
Excuse me. It takes the quality of grains that you select. You have to be very selective in your grain quality and your mash bills that you use, and also the water that goes into that product, the formalization and the distillation in combination with the fermentation and the whole. There's so many things that go into making the quality products I've been taught to make that it's this the number of things all have to come together. You can't slight one aspect of the process, or you won't wind up with the same quality.
I won't ask you which one your favorite is, because I know you get asked that all the time. But which one are you most likely to pick out at the end of the day when you're home getting ready to sit down and have a sip? Which one of your products do you pick?
our Evan Williams single barrel. That's my favorite. That's the one that I always go back to, and I like them all. Even, I will say, the Parker's Heritage. I'm going to put a plug in for my own brand there, but I do go back on the everyday basis when you have a drink, kick back at home after the end of the day is our Evan Williams single barrel.
Now, you mentioned the Heritage Collection. You're one of only 3 master distillers living with a whiskey named after them, with you and Elmer and Jimmy. What did you think when the folks said, we want to name a whiskey after you?
Very, very honored to have my name put to the forefront like that, and join the other group of the honored master distillers that have some bourbons named after them. I felt like I was in good company there.
And you and Elmer and Jimmy have been friends for years too, right?
Right. I've known them for years, and we don't have any secrets when it comes to master distillers, as well as Booker and myself when he was around, and we all shared, and Baker Beam, and we all had a good bond, and we would do anything we could to help further anybody's production if they were in need.
How do you want to be remembered?
Remembered being the true person I think I've always tried to be, not saying I know everything, because you always tend to learn everything from every day you're involved with this industry. And making bourbon, as I've said, you always have to have an open mind and be able to learn, because there's things that do crop up that you haven't seen happen when you think that everything's happened over 50 years that could happen. So you like to be remembered as being the true person and making the best products that you've been taught to do over that period of time and on into the future, and instill that into the next generation.
You can listen to the entire interview in episode 223 of WhiskyCast. Parker was one of the leaders of the Master Distillers Club, with members like Elmer T. Lee, Booker Noe, and, of course, Jimmy Russell, all legends in their own right. Jimmy Russell is one of those people who is always smiling, no matter what, and always has a story to tell. In March of 2009, Jimmy shared his tales with us in episode 193.
To age bourbon properly, it has to be in a dry place. And in the summers in Kentucky, ours was metal-clad buildings with tin on the sides. And ricks, you just roll the barrels in. And it gets real hot in the summertime. That bourbon expands out into that new charred oak wood. The wintertime it extracts. And at that time, and it's amazing when you ask the question, always think about alcohol evaporating a lot faster than water. But the pores in that wood are open, and that water is going out and leaving the concentration of alcohol. We lose in our aging process, the way we age. We have a lot of windows in our buildings. We open the windows in the summertime to get the good air circulation, and we lose about a third in 8 years of aging in our process. So that's evaporating out, and it's leaving the concentration of alcohol in there. Now, going to Scotland, Ireland, even bourbon, if you was in a damp, cool place where you didn't have that hot summers, it would do the same thing. And then that barrel, the pores in that barrel is pretty well closed. We've lost a third in it. So it's not really breathing like it would. If you brought Scotch and put it in barrels in Kentucky in a dry place, it would probably go up. But same way with bourbon. If we put it in a damp, cool place, it would go down and improve, because it does. The barrel won't breathe, what we call breathing, and then you got that consolidation of condensation, and that barrel dropping water back down in the barrels. But that's a big difference in them.
Now let's talk about the rest of the range, because you've added more expressions along the way.
Right. Well, we talked about the spirit, single barrel, the rare. Now we have the Russell's Reserve. It's a 10-year-old limited edition small batch bourbon, which is excellent. Not because it's got my name on it. And I tell people I tease and cut up. I like to tease and cut up. If you don't like it, to call Eddie Russell, my son. He's responsible for it. If you like it, I'm the one that said, but it's something we got together with. And I've got to give you my personal taste, and I think if you talk to Eddie, he would say the same thing. I don't think bourbon really starts maturing until it gets about 6 years old. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now, I don't like a real old bourbon because in that range of 7 to 12, you got the combination of the vanillas, the caramels, the sweetness, and the wood. The longer you leave it in that barrel, the more the white oak wood taste comes. If you like a lot of woody taste, you like an older bourbon. Me, personally, I just don't like a lot. I like the combination of all of them.
And then you've got the Russell's Reserve, right?
Now we come out with the Russell's Reserve rye. Now the rye, Wild Turkey's always made a rye, Wild Turkey rye. Now, I'm just opposite on rye whiskeys. I think rye whiskeys reach their peak around 6 to 8 years old. They're more spicy and all, and the longer you leave it in that new oak wood, the more spicy, the more woody it becomes. But my personal taste, and the Russell's is 6-year-old rye. It's between 6 and 8 years old. And that's the age I like on good rye whiskeys.
The Russell's Reserve puts you in a very unique category because basically it's you, Elmer T. Lee, and Parker Beam that are the only living distillers that have whiskeys named after you.
That's correct. We're the only three that it was. For a long time, it was just Booker and I, and then Elmer, and now Parker's there, and then Booker passed away on us, so it's and Elmer. We're all we're bitter enemies. We're all great friends. We're together all the time, and Elmer's getting way up there, but we're still seeing each other. He only lives 12 miles from me, so we see each other quite a bit.
Tell me about working around Elmer growing up. What was it like competing with him?
Well, we don't call it competing. It's competing one way, but we're close friends. We do anything we could to help each other, and we tease and go on all the time. And the fellow that runs Buffalo Trace, he was always trying to get Elmer and I together to get us to say. He finally says, "No use to fool with them two. You're not going to get anything to say anything about each other." And same way we had some the Thirsty Travelers. It's a television thing out of Canada, someplace. Mm-hmm. They had an interview with us several years ago, and they were trying the same thing. They finally said, "Just quit. They're not going to say anything about each other except cutting up with each other, teasing one another, but they're not going to say anything about each other." And one of the greatest things in my memory, Booker was, got in bad shape and passed away. A magazine had done an article on Booker and Elmer and I. They'd done the stories on us. And Booker wasn't doing too well, so we went to Booker's home to do the photo shoot. And we was down there all day, and the three of us, and people was with us. We were supposed to be down there for a couple hours. It lasted all day, and those people was having a great fun. We were too, on each other, going on and cutting up, and we had a great time. That's memories that I have with them three. I used to tease them a lot. Booker had been retired for several years. Elmer had been retired for a long time. And I was teasing them. I said, "Here you used to sit back home every day and do promotionals, and I have to go to work every day at the distillery." They laughed. And I still do. I'm still active in the distillery every day when I'm in town.
I never had the privilege of meeting Booker No, because I got into whiskey journalism after he had already passed on, sad to say. Tell me about Booker No.
Do you know Fred No?
Oh, I know Fred.
That's Booker?
Yeah.
Just exactly. Except Booker was, Freddie's a big boy. I still call him Freddie. Fred's a big boy. His dad was larger than he was. I like to stand by Booker. He made me look small. But they're just exactly alike. Booker was honest. I hope that's what you find with me, what we tell you, what I say. It's what I believe in. I'm not putting on a show or anything. Booker was the same way. Elmer's the same way. Parker's the same way. We tell you what we're doing. If we don't like it, we're going to tell you about it. We're not going to, the old saying in Kentucky, we're not going to beat around the bush about it. It's what we think about it.
Tell me about Parker Beam now, because it seems like the Russells, the Beams, a few of the other families around there have been in distilling a long time.
A long time. We've been in, and this is another thing is, I like so well about it. Think so much about it. Booker and I have been close friends forever. Parker and I have been close friends forever. And Bill Samuels, but now Bill's a little more in marketing and all. And even Bill's daddy. And then Bill's son. Right? But you got Craig Beam, Parker's son. You got Fred Booker's son and Eddie, my son. And they're all close friends. So you'll have to put up with the Nose and the Beams and the Russells for a long time.
Now, I have to ask, do you have any Nose or Beams working for you?
No, we don't. No, we don't. No.
Because I know there's a bunch of Nose working for other distilleries, a bunch of Beams working for other distilleries, and all that. And it's sort of this running joke. Yeah.
Parker worked for Heaven Hill.
Yeah.
Craig works for Heaven Hill. Uh-huh.
It really is just sort of one big family.
Well, you know, Freddie's wife, not Freddie's wife, I'm getting old and feeble. Booker's mother was a Beam. Booker No's mother was a Beam. Her sisters are the original Beams. And then down the line, still is Beam family, but and then they say that it's a lot of Beams out at a lot of different distilleries. I know for many years there was one with Seagram's. There was one at different places. It's always been Beams at other distilleries too. There's 2 or 3 sets of that Beam family. They all go back to the same original, but they worked at a lot of different distilleries.
If you had to go back and change anything about the way things have worked out in the whiskey business over your years in the business, what would you go back and change?
Well, really, we haven't changed nothing with Wild Turkey. The same formula, same cooking temperature. We've been fortunate, or I have, let me make it the same way all the time. You know, the bottom line is what counts. It's the expensive way we make Wild Turkey with at low proof, putting it in a barrel. We just don't pay a premium for our grains. They let me make it the way I want it, where, you know, nowadays everybody's looking. The biggest change, and it's helped more than anything, when I started, you done everything by hand. You run the still by hand. You have one hand on a pump, pumping into the still. You had nothing on the steam, controlling the proofs and everything. You got better equipment now. We still have that person sitting there, but you got equipment that makes that adjustment for you. And that's a little better because, you know, equipment's a little quicker than an individual sitting there with it, but we still have a person sitting right there with it, making sure that it meets the standards that we're looking for. And the worst problem I had when we got this, started putting in this equipment several years ago, the people that had been running the still makes a certain sound. We call it whistling. And if it changes, it means something's changing in the still. You need to add more steam or more product, fermented mash going in the still. And when we first put in the equipment, well, for a long time, that was the hardest thing I had. The people running the stills, they'd been so used to making adjustments themselves. When it's changed sound, they just want to run over and do the adjustments themselves. That was one of the biggest things that we had. But that's the biggest thing. You got, you know, better equipment now.
Did that help make the whiskey more consistent from batch to batch?
I think so. I mean, our still operators were excellent. But, you know, you're more, if something happened to happen, you wasn't right there. But with equipment, it's going to take care of that.
One of the really interesting things that's really sort of developed over the last few years is the whole bourbon tourism thing. Right. Because now you've got passionate Wild Turkey fans that are coming to visit you guys in Lawrenceburg.
Everybody out like what I'm doing right now, it was marketing salespeople. There wasn't nobody from production out in the field. And Austin Nichols Company, over 20 years ago or longer, decided they wanted me to go out and work with our salespeople and talk to people and explain how it operated. Now everybody has somebody about it, but I was the first one that I know of was out doing that. And now everybody has them. And the amazing thing to me over the years, when I started, bourbon is whiskey, it's all the same. People didn't have a lot of understanding about what it was. Nowadays, people knows. They know all about it, how and everything about the different ones and everything. It's amazing to me how much, and I think part of this is the bourbon trail. Part of it's y'all stories and videos and things like that. People's wanting to know. And they're becoming better educated themselves. They're on the internet, all these Bourbon Society they've got their own clubs and everything, and they're looking and they're studying about it, same way as the Scotches and everything else would down.
How much longer are you going to do this?
Well, I don't know. You know, I'm in good health. I tell people now, you know, when you're young, you have to work. Take care of your family. But now I work because I enjoy it. It's really not work to me. It's something I love to do. I go to still. I'm there every day. My wife says I'm there all the time. I live 6 miles away. You know, it takes me less than 10 minutes to get to work every day. And even on Saturdays and Sundays, I'll be out there. Maybe drive through and say hello to people running the stills and cookers and things, you know, and things like that. I'm in and out there all the time. Through the week, I'm there every day, 8 hours or more, if I'm not out traveling. And I'm at the plant 90% of my time. A lot of people think I'm traveling all the time, but I'm not. 90% of my time, year-round, I'm at the plant.
What do you want your legacy to be?
Well, you know, knowing the biggest thing I want is Wild Turkey being consistent. That it tastes the same today, tomorrow, 20 years ago. That's my thing. I want to be known as making a Wild Turkey bourbon was consistent in flavor and taste the whole time I was there. And I can promise you this, it will for the next 8 to 10 years, or 12. I can't guarantee you after that. That's what I'm making and putting in the barrel now, so I know what it's going to be. So after that, if something happens, you know, I won't promise that, but I know up until probably 2018, 2022, that part of it, if you buy a Russell's or 101 or Rare Breed, it's going to be consistent in flavor and taste.
From Jimmy to Jim now, as in Jim McEwan. I've often joked that Jim is one of my favorite interview subjects because, well, you ask him a question and then just sit back and relax because it'll be a few minutes before he's done answering it. Jim was a guest on the second episode of WhiskyCast, but it wasn't until episode 75 in January of 2007 that we had a chance to talk for more than just a couple of minutes.
Jim, I got to ask, first of all, how did you get started in the distillery business?
Well, when you're born in a distilling village like Beaumont, on a distilling island like Islay, it's every young man's ambition to work in a distillery, and I was no different. But I always wanted to be a cooper. I was fascinated by cooperage. I thought the coopers are really cool. They earn more money, they were better looking guys. They seemed to pull the chicks. So I thought, yeah, coopering's good. So I started as an apprentice cooper at the age of 15. And I served a 6-year apprenticeship as a cooper. And I also learned during that period, I learned malting, mashing, distilling, and cellar work. And that's all I ever wanted to be, was a cooper. And here we are today, travelling the world as an ambassador and making all sorts of whiskies.
You can still make a barrel, can't you? You actually still have the tools and everything, right?
Yeah, I've still got all my tools, and there are occasions at the distillery when we get some casks that come in with broken staves or damaged heads, so I will repair them. I just love to get the apron back on and get stuck into the cask again. Great. You know something? They said that the wheel was the greatest invention in the world. Well, it wasn't. The cask was the greatest invention. How else could one man move 12 hundredweights? How else could you move goods around the world? How else could you preserve wine and fruit and so on? Great invention. Who invented the cask? The Egyptians, the same people who invented distillation. And there's evidence of cooperage 2,000 years before Christ was born. Brilliant vessel.
Now, I understand there's a story about your current set of cooper's tools that were sort of handed down to you, right?
Yeah. My teacher, an old gentleman by the name of David Bell, he was a #1 cooper in Scotland. He was my teacher. And I went to see him on his deathbed. He was dying. He was 99 years old. So I went to see him. He was just about to leave this world for a better place. And he whispered in my ear, he says, "Jim, I'm leaving something for you." And I said, no, don't be silly, because you're going to live for a long time. He said, no, I am leaving tonight. I have spoken to the man. And he said, in my garden shed, underneath the floor, is a very, very special gift for you. and you will never ever be a poor man with the gift I have left you. And I thought nothing about it. However, a week after he died that night, as he rightly said, a week later I spoke to his family. I said that your dad said there was something underneath the floor of the garden shed. So we went out to the garden shed, and sure enough, there was a false bottom on the floor. And we took out a couple of planks, and there he had wrapped up all his axes, his knives, his hammers, the drivers, the shavers. He had wrapped them up in sackcloth, which had been soaked in oil to preserve them and stop them getting rusty. So he left me his tools to ensure I would always have money in my pocket. It's a wonderful, wonderful gift. Fabulous, what a thoughtful thing to do. I was absolutely thrilled, proud, humble, emotional about the whole thing. What more could he give me? He couldn't have given me any more.
And you still use those tools today, right?
Use tools today.
What's it like putting a barrel together?
When you're learning, it's very difficult. And you tend to make a lot of bad mistakes, you know what I mean? But when you manage eventually to put a barrel together right from scratch, you put it together and it actually holds whiskey and the whiskey doesn't run out. That is one of the great, great moments. It's just an awesome moment. One you never have. Lots of unforgettable moments. But when you put your whiskey into the first barrel you made and the whiskey doesn't come out, that is like, wow.
Now, how did you move from cooperage to distilling?
While I was at Beaumont, I was always distilling anyway. If somebody went off sick, I would jump in, do some mashing. If somebody went off in the still room, I would do distillation. Malting, working in maltings all the time. So I was very keen to learn, picking up as much as I could. And when my old friend retired, I then I became cellar master at Beaumont. And then the people at Beaumont said, would you like to come to Glasgow and train to be a whisky blender? And I said, yeah, I'll try that. So I studied under the chief blender for 2 years, and then I was a chief blender with Morrison for 6 years. Then Morrison said, would you like to come back and take over the distillery and get it going and get it really fired up? So I came back and started distilling again. So I've kind of been around the track, done most things, and it's a very privileged position I'm in. Some of the people I met, and when you go into a glass of whiskey, you look at the whiskey, and when you know all the people and the characters that have helped create this wonderful whiskey, many of them are not with us today, they've died and passed on, And what the whiskey reflects to me is not so much the aromas and the taste. I'm looking for the character and the personality of the mashman, the stillman, the maltman and the coopers. But it's a wonderful thing. You just concentrate and think about it. This was made by good men, and it's for me to go around the world promoting single malt. Of all the distillery, I promote every single malt. I regard it as the greatest privilege ever. I never take it for granted. I never take it lightly. It's just I'm so proud to be able to have this position. Which, when I was 15, if I became a cooper, that was it. That's all I wanted, But God has been good to me, and I hope I put something back into the industry and I really do hope that.
Now, I heard a story that you told a while back, a few years ago, something about you wanting to divert the still output into a swimming pool somewhere at Beaumont?
We did that at Beaumont, yeah. We had a warehouse, and the people of the island had always been after a swimming pool. So we emptied the warehouse, and I approached the committee of the swimming pool and I said, look, if I manage to get the directors of this company quite a few large whiskies and arrange a meeting with you, you just might be able to get them to hand over the warehouse to you. So I kept my part of the bargain. I got the directors kind of liquored up, introduced them to the swimming pool committee, and they took it on board, and sure enough, the directors of that time graciously handed over the warehouse to the people of Ireland as a swimming pool. And we had a very, very good engineer, and he thought, well, we've got all the waste heat coming from the stills, from the condensers, we could use that hot water to heat the swimming pool. And that's what we did. So it's been a wonderful thing for Islay. That was before the Suntory days. There's a guy called Mr. James Howick, he was the chairman, and he handed over this warehouse, which was a fantastic gift. So when you go to Bowmore Distillery, the water you're swimming in has gone into the distillery up, and it was always my ambition someday to send whiskey down instead of water. And the day I would do it would be the day that all the old people are in for the swimming session. They are called the Sunshine Club. So it's always been my dream to send whiskey down, and as they're swimming around, you become intoxicated, and you would. My idea was that you would be able to read in the paper, John McPhail, 71 years of age, sets new world record for the butterfly at Bowmore swimming pool.
Maureen Robinson was a trailblazer in the Scotch whisky business. Back in 1977, she joined the Old Distillers Company Limited as a chemist and wound up becoming the first woman to serve as a master blender in Scotland. 40 years later, we spent some time on the phone together for this interview from episode 632, shortly before her retirement.
Really, I probably came into business quite by accident. A lot of the people who came into whiskey came through family ties. You know, they had family connections and things like that. But I actually, I started to become a pharmacist, and then I took a year out, and within that time I got a job within DCL as a scientist, and so that's how I got into the business to start with.
Well, let's explain for everybody. DCL was the Old Distillers Company Limited, which was probably by about 3 generations the predecessor of today's Diageo.
Yes, it was, yes. When I joined, it was in 1977.
What were you doing as a scientist, and what were you studying in school that had you going into pharmacy, and then how did you wind up doing whiskey all of a sudden?
I'm not too sure. I'm still trying to figure out within my own mind why I decided to become a pharmacist at that time. But then where I lived quite close to Glenorchy Research Station at Menstrie. So when I took the year out, I applied for a job there, and I got the job. So I decided not to go back to university and just to do an HNC in chemistry instead. And in that job as a scientist, basically what I was doing, we were trying to understand Scotch more from a scientific perspective. You know, trying to figure out what makes Scotch. You know, like all the compounds and things like that.
And you had to do this without the benefit of the gas chromatographs and all of the high-tech tools we have today, didn't you?
No, we did have gas chromatographs in these days as well, but what the actual preparation of samples was a lot more laborious. You know, you had to mix it with solvents, then you had to dilute the solvents down, then you had to inject them into the gas chromatographs. But nowadays, it's all like straight injection. It's a lot easier than what it was in my day.
They have it so easy today, don't they, those kids?
Yes, they do.
Tell me how you made the switch over to blending, though, because we know that there have been a lot of women that worked in the whiskey industry, but not many made it to blending before you did, right?
No, there wasn't. When I first came into blending, it was like most distillery, bottling halls, mainly women were in the bottling halls and things like that. There wasn't a lot of people in sort of blending and even in the production side, in the distilling, you didn't have many women there. But nowadays, you've got like 40% of women in our malt distilling part of the business. So it has grown over the years.
How did you make the switch?
When I first started in the research station, you got checked to see if you had a very good sense of aroma and flavour, and it turned out I did. So there was a project came about in 1985, 86 that I was part of, and that was really looking at different whiskies, nosing them and tasting them and trying to make up a sort of a bespoke blend. And in 86, new innovation was not as popular as what is today within the Scotch whisky industry. So that was how I got started, and then I just moved over into blending after that.
How did you know that you had a good nose until they tested you?
Yeah, it was just once I was tested. I had never really actually paid much attention to my nose before. And it sometimes can get you into some deep trouble if you're at somebody's house. You know, they'll give you something and you got to the stage you started putting it to your nose first, and you thought that could be quite rude because your nose and everything that somebody gave you at the time.
How did you wind up developing your nose after you found out how good it was? Because I know that it's like a muscle. You have to exercise your nose, don't you?
Yes, I think what it is we every year, well, not every year, but every so often we get audited, and way back then it was the same. You got audited to make sure you were still, your nose was still performing the way you were expecting it to do. So you just kept on nosing different whiskies, maybe whiskies that were spiked with different compounds, just so that you could build up your language. And over the years, I've kind of built up my own language. What I've always found when it comes to nosing is that it doesn't matter what you describe it as long as you're consistent with your descriptions. So when you actually are doing nosing, you know in your own mind what you mean. It could be, I might say something grassy, somebody else might think it's fruity. As long as every time you make that descriptor, you know in your own mind what you're thinking about.
As you pointed out, you were the first woman really to join the blending team at DCL and later Diageo.
Yes.
Was there ever a time when what was probably then an old boys club made you feel unwelcome at times? Was it hard for you?
I must admit, I didn't. I found it okay. Everybody I met were really, courteous, and I think it's because they sort of thing with my ability. They knew I was good at my job and things like that. And if there was any detrimental comments, it tended to be maybe behind my back, but I never actually heard anything. But I think I actually did. I worked my way into that they understood that I knew what I was talking about, and I was really understanding on what Scotch was all about.
You really were sort of the pioneer for women in the blending industry. When you look at the industry today, as you pointed out, 40% of the Scotch whisky industry, at least, is now composed of women in production and blending operations. When you look at the landscape today, what do you think?
Yeah, I like to think that I helped to pioneer that going forward. That it gives people the sort of opportunity that they had the ability that women could break into that side of the business. It wasn't just all that you could do something for your ability, not just because it was historically it was men that actually did that job, that women were able to do that job.
I know that you don't go to many of the whiskey shows and whiskey festivals. I know you tend to stick pretty much close to the blending lab. But when you do go out to these events, what do you think when you see the landscape now with more women going to whiskey festivals and more women becoming interested in whiskey? It really does cross all gender lines now.
Yes, it does. It really is sort of heartwarming to find that women in all spheres of life are now starting to enjoy whiskey, because I know way back years ago it tended to be men drank whiskey and women very rarely did, but I think nowadays it is so nice to see it going across different spectrums of people.
Now, I promised to get off the questions about women at this point. Let's talk about blending, because one of the things that you're most known for is that you blend, and your team blends the single malts within Diageo.
Yes, that's right, yes.
As opposed to Jim Beveridge's team that does the Johnny Walker and the blends.
Yes.
Tell me about the difference between blending for a single malt expression as opposed to blending for a blended Scotch expression.
It's actually very similar to the way you actually approach things, because a lot of people might, most people who know Scotch, they realise that a single malt is almost like a blend as well. So, because sometimes you're using, it's just a single distillery, but you can be using different ages, you can be using different woods. So it's all about getting the right balance of everything as well. So it's very similar to doing a blend, because a blend, basically, you've got different distilleries that you can mix together with malt and grain, or sometimes it's a blended malt, then it could be all malt. But the single malt is just very similar to the exact same. And also, you're really looking for different characters. You've got, through experience, through the ages, what something might nose like at a different age, and then that certain type of wood.
Do you guys have a rivalry between you and Jim? And do you ever say, Jim knows this is better than your stuff? Or does he ever come back to you? And is there any competition between you and Jim here?
No, there's not. We work together and work as a team.
I had to ask.
We are involved as a team. We're involved in blends and malts, so it's not really that much rivalry.
Maureen Robinson paved the way for women like Stephanie McLeod to build careers in the Scotch whisky business. The award-winning Dewar's Master Blender has been a guest on WhiskyCast several times in recent years. But during our first conversation in March of 2019, she explained the mystique behind whiskey.
In whiskey, there's a real sense of history, because can you remember what you were doing 32 years ago? You know, all the things that have happened while this whiskey has been sitting quietly aging, and all the turmoil of the world that's been going on around it. And then you open the cask and suddenly it sees the light of day. So, you know, I think I've got the best job in the world. But, you know, that's just me saying that. But I don't think there's many people that get that opportunity to see something for the first time in so many years.
So how did you get this job? Where did you get your start?
With becoming a whiskey blender, it sometimes is being in the right place at the right time. But I did food science at University of Strathclyde, and I was fortunate that the department I was in had a link with the whiskey industry. And after a short spell in the soft drinks industry, my old supervisor from Strathclyde Uni said, "Would you like to come back and do whiskey research?" And I said, yes, I would. So I spent 4 years looking at the sensory aspects of whiskey and trying to determine what is it about the composition of whiskey that makes it taste the way it does, particularly looking at maturation. I'm happy to say that we never actually discovered what it is about whiskey that makes it taste the way it does, because now that I'm a blender, that's part of the joy of it. Because we've managed to control quite a bit about whiskey through science and observing the distillation process and observing maturation, but we never really know what we're going to get until you open the cask. So that's really, my background was in research, and after the 4 years I decided I really wanted to be in the whiskey industry, because I'd fallen in love with it at that point, because I didn't know anything about whiskey up until that point. And, you know, when I realised the impact of the wood and, you know, on the new make distillate, I then became engrossed in the subject of Scotch whisky.
Is blending an art or a science?
It's both. There's certain aspects of it that, you know, we like to test every inch of the whisky. So as well as the sensory part of it, we like to make sure that there's nothing in it that might affect the product in future years. But there's also an instinct in whisky that you, after a while of dealing with the whiskies for so long, you then get to know, you know, what whisky goes well with another whisky, perhaps what type of cask might work better with a particular type of whisky. Obviously, we have recipes written down, stored in our inventory systems for all of our blends, so that if something were to happen, then the brand can go on. So, but there is a definite marriage of science and art with whisky.
So you've had to cough a couple of times during this interview, and nothing wrong with that, but what do you do when you get a cold?
Well, we have a sensory panel at Dewar's. So these are a group of people that have been trained in looking at what is the profile of Dewar's and then comparing that against what we then blend. So there's always a backup team that if I'm on holiday or I've got a cold, then there's someone else there. And I also have an assistant blender who noses everything with me as well. So there's always a backup plan.
Jim Cryle spent 40 years in the whiskey business before retiring in 2006 as master distiller at the Glenlivet, but he did some of his work on the smallest still in Scotland. He and Ian Logan came up with the idea to put a small bootlegger's still back into operation for special occasions at the distillery. Here's part of my conversation with Jim Cryle, recorded at Whiskey Live Toronto in October of 2006 for episode 64.
Tell me about your first day in the distillery, 40 years ago. What was it like?
Well, oh gosh. Well, I started off actually originally in, there was a laboratory in Glasgow, and I started off down there. And then the first time I went to the distillery and went to Tamdhu was into the malting plant, and it just, I'd obviously read books before I went for the interview to make sure that I knew what I was talking about, but it was just so different, there was just a sense of the people who were there. It was like a big family, and they didn't regard me as some young whippersnapper in here to run things. You know, they welcomed me and told me all about what was happening around the place, and not so much for myself, but for my wife. Although we were only engaged at the time, and I took her up to shore where we were going to live when we got married, and she thought, "Where the hell are you taking me?" away into the hills.
And then off to Islay, right?
And then off to Islay. A couple of years later, off to Islay. Yeah, sure. Islay was good. I enjoyed Islay. I never acquired a taste for Islay whiskies. I can enjoy one, but I'm not a big fan of peaty whiskies. But it was all part of my experience and learning about the industry and seeing the way different whiskies were created.
That brings up an interesting point when you say you don't like peated whiskies. How have you, over the last few years, changed or tweaked the character of the Glenlivet, or have you, to make it the style of whiskey that you like?
Well, I haven't tweaked it in any way at all. Basically, it should be still pretty much the same as it was, 170 years ago when the distillery first started, because it's on the same site, it's the same shape and size as stills. We've got old photographs and records and things that show us what they were doing in those days. So it goes back to what you said about technology and how things have changed. I think it's probably more consistent today than it was. I mean, I always felt that part of my job was to ensure that the newly distilled whiskey tasted the same each day, each week, each year. And modern technology has helped you to ensure that consistency.
But does it take something out of the overall fun to come up with something different every once in a while?
Yeah, well, the fun in coming up with something different is in the maturation and selecting different casks. So, the 15-year-old French oak, which was originally, we did it as a 12-year-old and then we moved it to 15. That's where the fun comes in. For me, the fun is in going into the warehouse and sampling different casks, different ages. They've been filled once, twice, 3 times, whatever. That's the fun part, because you're never quite sure what you're going to get.
Paint that picture for me when you're walking into the distillery warehouse in the morning. What's it like?
Well, the first thing that hits you is the aroma. I mean, all the old style warehouses have got very thick stone walls, so it's nice and cool, a little bit humid, and what hits you is that peppery alcohol aroma when you walk in. And I don't know quite just how to describe that, but I mean, if you do it, it's just one of those things that hits you. And then to go along and pull the bung in a cask and take a sample of that and put it in a glass and nose it, magic, absolutely magic.
Another underappreciated distiller who deserves more recognition is Barry Crockett, who retired in 2013 after 47 years at Irish Distillers and 65 years at Middleton Distillery. You see, his father was the distillery manager when Barry was born in the distiller's cottage. In February of 2013, we talked just days after he'd received Whiskey Magazine's Lifetime Achievement Award and announced his retirement.
It's only beginning to actually really hit me, as they say, and honestly I feel like someone who's won the Oscars, not just been nominated but won an Oscar. It's really absolutely, I feel overwhelmed by it, to be perfectly frank.
What did you think when they told you that you had been named this year's Lifetime Achievement Award winner?
Just overawed, I must honestly say. I mean, there's no. I mean, I can honestly say that I've met John on a few occasions, and he's a real, very nice gentleman. And knowing that the people who have been selected in various other annual awards, they're really icons of the industry, and to be regarded as in the same field as those is just overpowering, really.
And you decided to hang it up right after that and announce your retirement, essentially, right?
Well, my retirement was coming up anyway, Mark, because I'll actually be 65 in next month.
So this was sort of mandated, essentially, right?
Yes, indeed.
But now that you're winding down at the end of a very long career, tell me about some of the highlights of that you're going to leave behind when you finally drive out of Middleton for the final time.
Well, the highlights, I suppose, really that I would see in the Irish whisky industry and in the life of Irish distillers is the building of the present Middleton distillery, which, as you know, you've seen yourself. That was a truly transformative decision to take, and in my career, it was an absolutely splendid opportunity to become involved in the commissioning of that, and of course to use the flexibility inbuilt into that to refashion the world of Irish whisky. So that was really a marvellous opportunity and really a brilliantly exciting time.
Let's talk about that for a second, because your father was the original master distiller at the New Middleton plant when it opened in 75 or so.
Correct.
And you inherited that from him a few years later on his retirement, and now you're getting ready to open a new expansion at Middleton of your own as you leave.
Absolutely. I mean, it's an amazing coincidence, an absolutely amazing coincidence that just in fact next week we will be starting to commission a brand new set of columns, and I'll be there for that, and shortly thereafter we will be commissioning the brand new, what we describe as the Garden Stillhouse, the new extension to the distillation capacity of the distillery. And it's truly an amazing coincidence that just as I'm about to retire, this, shall we say, brand new extension, brand new facility is coming on stream.
And I made reference to this earlier, but you succeeded your father as the master distiller, and you were actually born in the cottage on the grounds.
Yes.
And one thing we never really talked about when we sat down in the cottage a few years ago was how your dad wound up in the business.
Well, I can certainly bring you up to date on that. Basically, my dad was employed by a man by the name of Norbert Murphy. Now, Norbert Murphy was what you would describe in the States as the president or chairman of the Cork Distilleries Company. The Cork Distilleries Company had been established in Cork City going back to about 1800, in the sense that the Murphy family bought out most of the distilling companies in Cork City. So, fast forward, as I say, to the 1920s, 1930s. My father was employed by Norbert Murphy as a laboratory chemist, and in fact it was my father and Norbert Murphy who developed initially and improved Cork dry gin in what was then known as the Watercourse Distillery in Cork City. So that distillery was purely a gin distillery, and also it had a yeast factory attached to that, so it produced a baker's yeast for the baking business, and as I said, produced neutral spirit and Cork dry gin. So then, I don't know the precise date, but would think it would have been in probably about 1944, 1943, My father was appointed head distiller. Again, he was quite young at the stage, about 30 or 31. He became head distiller of the old Middleton distillery and remained in that position until he retired in 1974-75.
And that's the distillery that people can tour now as part of the Jameson experience.
Correct.
But it's not the actual production distillery, which is up the hill where you've been working since the 1970s.
Correct, yes. So that old distillery is open. It's actually a very, very important, I suppose, industrial heritage site, and it tells the full story of the original old distillery. And luckily, most of the old equipment is still actually on site there.
What was it like growing up there back in the day when that was a working plant every day?
Well, you've got to cast your mind back to the sort of mid-1960s, and you can imagine that certainly in the case of Ireland at that stage, there really was very little economic development. Ireland was still at that point very much an agricultural-based country, so things were at a much slower pace than is currently the case, for obvious reasons. But the distilling business was very much a family-type operation. Most of the people working there had fathers and grandfathers in the business. All of the farmers who supplied grain had a very intimate knowledge and knew the type of grain that they needed to produce. And indeed, when I started work, and indeed my very first job was to actually to meet farmers and effectively take samples of their grain and carry out a little analysis before deciding whether or not the grain was adequate for the actual distilling process. So, of course, the plant, in terms of technology, was, I suppose, rather dated. There had been very little investment in distilling in Ireland, I would say, from about 1819, maybe 1900, right up to, obviously in our case, to 1975. So really, when I started work in the mid to late 1960s, I was really starting to work in a very traditional environment.
A couple of years ago, you were honored with the Middleton Barry Crockett Legacy release, which was the first whiskey to be named for a distiller at Irish Distillers and the predecessors, going all the way back to John Jameson. What is the Barry Crockett Legacy going to be, as far as you're concerned? How do you want to be remembered in the industry, since a month from now there won't be a Crockett at Middleton for the first time in 70 years?
Well, there will not be a Crockett at Middleton, certainly for the first time in 70 years, and obviously that's going to be a distinct change. But I think my legacy really is epitomized in the Barry Crockett legacy, because what it means is that the result of all our efforts, and obviously my particular effort, has been to represent Irish whiskey, and particularly the Irish potstill whiskey style, back to a world market. And if you take that as a distinct example, but also take the example of one which is maybe a little bit better known, namely the Redbreast range, I think you can clearly see that there is a very, very strong appeal and a very strong recognition that this Irish potstill style really is something that people aspire to. So I think I would like to think that my legacy is that not just for the first time in 70 years, but for the first time maybe in 100 years, or maybe a little bit more, that Irish whiskey is seen as really top class and restoring its level of imagery and its level of growth back to what was very, very evident in the sort of 1880s, 1890s.
Barry Crockett is one of those people who puts the history of whiskey in perspective compared to his own accomplishments, and truly defines the word gentleman. During the pandemic, we offered live webcasts each week with whiskey makers from around the world, and it was a chance to see them having some fun with each other, all in good humor, of course. For instance, this webcast segment with Richard Paterson of White & Mackay and Glenmorangie's Dr. Bill Lumsden in May of 2020.
A lot of people maybe don't realize this in America. You know, both Bill and I are true Highland whiskies. You know, forget about your Speyside guys. We are actually 23 miles from Inverness, and that's where the distillery is. But we only go 14 miles up the road where we see the lovely Glenmorangie distillery. So we're neighbours, and we've actually been neighbours for so many years now, because even during the bad times, good times, when you guys were the U.S. Navy in 1918, came over from America, and we did all the landmines at Dalmore, we sent our whiskey where? We sent it over to Glenmorangie, places like that. So we worked together even as close as that all those years ago. So that's why, Bill, I love you.
Yeah. Me
And
too,
you're
Richard.
neighbors, too, down on the southwest coast between Jura and Ardbeg, too. So we could
that's right.
Can't really count that out either.
Yeah, and actually, just when we're on that subject, because Bill, maybe you could correct me. Was it not something in? Let me just see. Was it not the 19th of March, 2008? You took a name called Corrie Vrecken.
It was on that date that we quite correctly got in there before you guys did and chose that wonderful name for one of our Ardbeg whiskies.
Wait, just to remind people so there's no confusion, Ardbeg is on a place called Isla, is that right?
That's correct, Richard.
Jura is on a place called Jura.
That's correct also.
North of Jura, what do you find? Corrie.
I think if you
find Glen Ardbeg or anything like that.
I think if you go into the sea off the islands of both Isla and Jura, you'll come across the Corrie Vrecken whirlpool. You know, first mover advantage and all that good stuff, Richard.
Fawn Weaver is a force of nature, tenacious, passionate, and driven, and when she got hold of the Nearest Green story a few years ago, she ran with it and turned Uncle Nearest Tennessee Whiskey into a $100 million brand. If you're not familiar with the story, Nearest Green is the former enslaved man who not only taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey, but worked alongside Jack with his sons in the years following the Civil War. My first interview with Fawn Weaver came in November of 2017.
Nathan Nearest Green. Nathan is new not only to the story, the name itself, but it's actually new to the family. So it was in my research that I discovered that was his legal name. When you are in Lynchburg, even to this day, almost all of his grandchildren, he still has a granddaughter who's still alive, believe it or not, 107 years old. And when I was with her a couple weeks ago for lunch, they were feeding her pureed food, and she turns to me and says, "I want fried chicken." So she's still alive and kicking, and Nearest's son, George Green, who is most known for assisting his father in the whiskey business and is the man who is seated to the immediate right of Jack Daniel on that photo that has kind of gone around the world for good reason. His granddaughter, we took her on a private tour of Jack Daniel's just a couple weeks ago, and it was fascinating to watch her interact. Number one, there's a portion of the distillery that actually belonged to her granddad, and she grew up in part on that parcel of land that overlooks the entire distillery. And so that family has always been a part of the Lynchburg and helping to build that community. There was never a separation, as odd as this may sound, between blacks and whites in Lynchburg. They always lived and worked side by side following the Civil War, so I should probably be clear about that. But following the Civil War, there was this interesting change that happened in Lynchburg that took a lot longer to happen throughout Tennessee. And quite frankly, we're still looking at it sort of working itself out as we continue to work toward perfecting our union. But in Lynchburg itself, Nearest's family and Jack's family always lived side by side, worked side by side, ate dinner together. They spent time together, and to this day, it is the same. So in terms of my research, when I first learned about the story of Nearest Green, and learned that there was possibly an African American who was, at least at the time, the press reports made it seem as though he was behind Jack Daniel Distillery, or that the recipe being used was that of nearest green. And as a researcher who has now put more than 2,500 hours of research and brought together a team of about 20 historians and archivists and archaeologists and conservators to truly ensure that the story that is written is true and can be backed up. In doing all of that, I still could not tell you whose recipe it is. So there was a lot out there that as I began digging into this story, that I had to separate fact from fiction. And in researching, what I can say as absolute fact is we did discover that Nearest Green was the first master distiller for Jack Daniel Distillery and remained in that role until at least May of 1881. And we can also say that he is the first African-American master distiller on record in the United States. That is not to say that there were not other African-Americans who were distilling whiskey, but he was the first who was actually put fully in charge of the still and entrusted to make the whiskey.
And he's the one who taught Jack Daniel how to make whiskey, theoretically, right?
He is the one who taught him how to make, but it is also the case that I'm sure Jack had a lot of different teachers. Obviously, my focus is on Nearest, and specifically what Nearest taught that I do not believe Jack learned from anyone else is the Lincoln County process. So when I talk about his method of teaching Jack whiskey, it was what distinguishes Tennessee whiskey from bourbon.
Why did it take so long, and you may not be the person to answer this, this may have to come from somebody at Brown-Forman, but why did it take so long for the Jack Daniels brand to accept Nearest Green, or had they always done it just quietly and nobody ever really made a big deal about it?
Well, that is going to be a question for Brown-Forman, and I never want to answer anything on their behalf. What I can say without question is when Jack Daniel was alive, he acknowledged Nearest. He acknowledged Nearest's boys who were involved in the whiskey business with him from the very beginning, from his very founding. And when it was passed on to his nephew, Lim Motlow, and then when it was passed on to Lim's boys, the four, what we all call the shirt sleeve brothers, when it was passed on to them, they all acknowledged Nearest's role and George Green's role and Eli Green's role. And until 72 is the last time I actually see Nearest acknowledged by Brown-Forman as being, well, not by Brown-Forman, but just in general, as being the first master distiller for Jack Daniel Distillery. And it was in an article, a 22-page article, if you can believe that, by Tennessee Historical Quarterly. They put out this little mini magazine, and it was solely on Lynchburg, Tennessee, and Jack Daniel Distillery. And on page, I believe, 5, it lists their master distillers from the very beginning until that current time, which was Frank Bobo, and who is my next door neighbor, by the way. And so they listed it, and they listed Nearest Green as the first head distiller, which is what a master distiller was called at that time. Beyond 72, I cannot tell you why he disappeared from the books.
How did you discover all this, and what's your interest in all this? It seems like an interesting story, but unless you've got a real connection to it, why would you jump into all this just to tell this story and go all out to not only do all the research and hire the researchers, but create a Nearest Green brand?
Well, there's a couple of things. Number one, a connection is I am African American. And in this country, as a minority, when you see someone who did something with such a level of excellence, and it is a very, very rare opportunity that we get a chance to see someone who went from slavery to helping to create one of the largest American brands in history. I don't know that there's another story like this in any industry. And so, quite frankly, if I had read it and it was, I don't know, we found out that it was really a former slave versus, I'm going to say Levi Strauss, but I don't know who came before him on jeans, or just a different brand where we found out its origin began in great part with an African American, then I am going to have a great deal of interest in that. Anything that we do as a group of people and we do it with excellence, I have a great interest in that. And so that was the case with this story with Nearest Green, is when I was looking at it, I thought the first question I had was, how is it possible that I, as a person who reads all the time, and two, the only alcohol that I drink for the most part is whiskey, how is it possible as a whiskey connoisseur, if I would be so bold as to call myself that, which I really don't. I just love a good whiskey. But how could I, as a person who at the time drank Jack Daniel's Single Barrel a great deal, didn't know a whole lot about the story, but enough that if this had been included in the story, I would have been aware of it. And so that is where I started. I happened to have been in Singapore on a business trip with my husband when we both read the story on the cover of the New York Times International Edition. And we both looked at each other with this look of, you have got to be kidding me. And not in a negative way, just a, how unbelievably amazing is this story if it is true, because then it doesn't just live as a story that's on a newspaper. He's an executive vice president for Sony Pictures. In my history, I generally combine investments with a story. And so when I'm looking at it from a perspective of what is the story that can be told, but what is the brand that allows that story to continue living long after people have stopped purchasing the book. And so this was one of those very, very rare instances where I was able to do that again. And I've only been able to do that with one book before. And so it was very exciting to me from the moment I saw it.
To this day, proceeds from the sales of Uncle Nearest have gone to benefit his descendants in the form of full college scholarships. We've been able to cover a wide range of topics on WhiskyCast, from personalities to getting down and dirty in the nerd world where science rules the day. Dr. Don Livermore is an expert on the interaction between wood and whiskey and tried to explain some of his groundbreaking research to me during a WhiskyCast live webcast in March of 2022.
One of the issues we face with Canadian whiskey producers is we do buy used barrels from a number of bourbon producers, just like many other whiskey categories around the world. And one of the things I struggle with, Mark, is the quality of those barrels that come in. Today, the best test, it really is the sniff test. You put your nose in the barrel. Does it have any off odors? And what is it the risk to the brand? So what I was trying to do with my PhD was take infrared sensors, measure the inside of the barrel, and in about 30 seconds, I would be able to quantify the amount of wood that would come into whiskey over the life of the aging period. So in other words, when we buy barrels from bourbon producers, I don't know if they're 4-year-old or 20 years old, right? How much wood is there left to give? And that was the thought and the thesis to my PhD. Unfortunately, that's kind of where I left it at. Theoretically, you could do it in 30 seconds. I could tell you the quality of a barrel. The difficult part, I guess that's what PhDs are about, is the theoretical side of things. But I would need to work with a fiber optics company to be able to get probes inside here's a bung here, here's the size of a bung hole, and be able to touch the surface of inside the barrel. So that's kind of where I left it at. It is doable to be able to measure the quality of a barrel, and that was the sense of my PhD. So the studies of that, I know the types of wood molecular compounds that could come into your whiskey, how quickly, which ones are more important than others, and then I think that then leads into the J.P. Weiser's dissertation, which we released. The small batch was part of us playing around with New Virgin Oak for the first time. Weiser's Legacy, the Red Letter, all those brands were pretty much the very beginning of all the PhD work that I was working on. And today, now we're talking about Peter Quarter cask and things like that. So it's just kind of momentum has built from that about 10 years. And actually, Mark, 10 years ago this week was when I defended my PhD. It's actually 10 years ago this week.
Happy anniversary.
Yeah. Don't want to do that again, defend a PhD, but yeah, it's been 10 years since I've completed it.
Does it matter where on the inside of the barrel the probe touches? Or could you use it, put the fiber optics onto a longer probe and touch the bottom of the barrel through the other side of the barrel through the bung?
You got to get under the char surface because the way the light would reflect off the black char, you got to get underneath the surface where the interaction will occur with your whiskey. So that was another takeaway in the learning, which is the challenge is how could you get a fiber optic probe into a barrel and then get it so it's now touching all the different surfaces of the barrel. But I see where you're going with it because you're thinking is a used barrel because of the evaporation.
No.
Oh, I thought that's where you're going to ask.
No, I'm thinking the heads, the inside of the heads, because the heads are only toasted.
Yeah, some are charred. Depends where you're buying them from. But yeah,
but most of the time they're just toasted.
Yeah, I got one here behind. I can pick it up in front of my camera if you want. We have some that are charred as well.
Okay, but not every cooperage chars the heads, but that might be a way to do it.
Yeah. I was a little concerned when I was doing a PhD. It depends if you have the way the barrels sit, right? As it ages over time, is there some staves and some sections that are going to give you a higher concentration of wood more so than others? That was where I was thinking you were going to ask the question. But I think at the end of the day, there's lots of research that could be done with barrels. I mean, what is the sweet spot for burning it in terms of temperature to get vanilla or more smoky or spicy notes? And I think that's the fun part about whiskey, Mark. I mean, there's so many things that you can do around barrels and how you burn it and temperature profiles and toasting and that sort of thing. Keeps me up at night, Mark.
Yeah, but how do you get to work with the cooperages if you're buying mostly used barrels to actually experiment with some of this stuff?
We do work with coopers. We have some in Kentucky. We got a couple that in Kentucky we work with, and then there's one in Europe that we work with as well. That we're working for certain specifications and certain quality types for the barrels. So they'll sell us new barrels just like they would a bourbon producer. I think that's the wonderful thing about Canadian whiskey. We're just not held to putting it into a new barrel. I mean, we can put it into different types of bourbon barrels, wheated bourbon barrels, like I mentioned, sherry and cognacs and sauternes barrels earlier. I mean, that's the beautiful thing, and I'll keep coming back. Is blending is beautiful. I mean, you can bring a lot of characters into your whiskey, and it's fun. You can tell I have fun with it.
Finally, no retrospective would be complete without hearing from the late Dave Pickerel. He was the master distiller at Maker's Mark before setting out to become the Johnny Appleseed of craft distilling. He worked with dozens of small-scale distillers around the world, teaching them the art and craft of craft distilling. I spoke with Dave many times over the years, but it was our final conversation in September of 2018, just a few weeks before he died, that sticks with me to this day. If there's one soundbite that sums up Dave's life, it's this one.
So what was more fun, all the years at Maker's Mark or doing the Metallica project?
All I can say is, on the cover of the Rolling Stone, gonna buy 5 copies for my mother. How can I not say that that's fun as hell? I love Maker's Mark. I still call it we. But, oh, my God, this boy from the slums got his picture with Metallica in the Rolling Stone. What's not to love about that?
That's Dave Pickerel, and it seems like a good way to end our look back at the first 1,000 episodes of WhiskyCast. There are many more interviews and people that could easily have been included here, and I want to thank everyone who's ever done an interview with me for your support of WhiskyCast. We also want to thank all of our sponsors, both past and present, because without their support, we never would have made it to 1,000 episodes. That's WhiskyCast in Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. Let's begin with this year's edition of the Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition for the 2023 U.S. Open this June. It's finished in Napa Valley wine casks and bottled at 43% ABV. The nose is fruity with touches of raspberries, strawberries, a soft oakiness, and hints of nutmeg and honey. The taste has a thick, syrupy mouthfeel that reminds me of raspberry jam, along with strawberries, soft spices, a touch of black cherries, and red grapes. The finish is long and fruity with a hint of underlying spice, And I'm scoring the 2023 Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition a 93. Next up, I mentioned the Barman 1873 bourbon from the Coors Whiskey Company last week and received a sample of it the other day. It's a blend of straight bourbons, bottled at 46% ABV. The nose has notes of caramel, vanilla, leather, dried fruits, and a slightly dusty character. The taste is thick and chewy with wood spices, oak, honey, and vanilla, while the finish is long and spicy. I'm scoring the Barman 1873 bourbon a 90. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, our tasting notes are brought to you this week by Sagamore Spirit, a 200-time award-winning Maryland-style rye whiskey. With a determined focus to create the best rye whiskey imaginable, Sagamore's team of distillers crafts each spirit with a nod to both tradition and innovation. Find their signature, Double Oak, Cask Strength, or Reserve Series ryes, as well as their line of premium rye whiskey canned cocktails, at a retailer near you. Visit sagamorespirit.com/find-rye. Please drink responsibly. Ernest Hemingway was known as a whiskey lover, and the rye whiskey that carries his name has a Caribbean rum-inspired influence. It's finished in rum-seasoned Oloroso sherry casks and was created by the Call family of Kentucky distilling fame. The first edition of Hemingway Rye is bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has baking spices, molasses, brown sugar, and a slight hint of spearmint. The taste has notes of clove, cinnamon, and nutmeg, balanced out by molasses, brown sugar, and a hint of toffee. The spices build up leading into the finish, which is long and spicy along with dried fruits. I'm scoring the Hemingway Rye First Edition a 91. Last month, Lost Lantern Spirits won the award for Best American Single Malt at the World Whiskies Awards for Gentle Giant, a blend of casks from Balcones Distilling in Texas. It's bottled at 57.6% ABV. The nose is warm and aromatic with a nice malty character and touches of honey, red apples, and vanilla buttercream. The taste is thick and mouth-coating with good spices, barley sugar, red apples, and vanilla, while the finish is long and spicy with a hint of oak. I'm scoring Lost Lantern's Gentle Giant Single Malt a 93. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 3,400 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
Kentucky and Ireland have plenty in common. Two homes of horse racing. Bluegrass music is said to have Irish roots. Okay, it's not the longest list, but the Redbreast Kentucky Oak Edition only strengthens the bond. Finished in sustainably sourced Kentucky oak for a captivating nose and round taste. I see a triple crown in this thoroughbred's future.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
Time now for our community segment, highlighting some of your comments in the WhiskyCast community app and on social media this week. I want to thank everyone who passed along their congratulations on this 1,000th episode of WhiskyCast over the past few days. It would not have been possible without your support over the years. To that end, I want to share this voicemail message from longtime listener Juan Cruz in Rhode Island.
Hello, WhiskyCast. Mark, Christina. On this special milestone of 1,000 episodes of WhiskyCast, I wanted to leave you a voice note congratulating you and the team for such an amazing milestone and accomplishment. 1,000 episodes. That's fantastic. I became a listener in 2019. I have been listening since then, and I've also gone through the entire archive from episode 1 all the way through the last episode, and it has been a fantastic journey. Like I've said before, it really helped through lockdown to have WhiskyCast to listen to and look forward to every week. So going forward, wish you the best, lots of success, and many more episodes of WhiskyCast in the future. And since it's 5 o'clock somewhere, here with some Double Valley 15 single barrel to celebrate many more years of podcasting for WhiskyCast. Slancha.
Thank you, Juan. We truly appreciate it. Martin Fielder posted this question in the WhiskyCast community app. I was wondering, what have been the biggest changes in the whiskey industry over the life of the podcast? I'm sure there's a lot to cover there over 17 to 18 years. Well, there's a lot to unpack there. Probably the biggest change, in my opinion, is the explosion of small-scale distilling all over the world. Back in 2005, there were just the big industry players to keep track of, and I'd hear about new releases maybe once or twice a week. Now my email inbox is jammed with new release announcements almost every day, many of them from craft to distillers who have given whiskey lovers much more diversity in choices and flavors, and forced the big players to respond with better offerings of their own. There's more transparency than ever before, and whiskey consumers have become much more well-informed. When I started out, there were just a few magazines and blogs out there, and of course no other podcasts about whiskey. Of course, all that has changed. We still have just a few magazines devoted to whiskey, but the world has become more interconnected thanks to the Internet, with hundreds, if not thousands, of whiskey blogs and online publications, and, of course, dozens of podcasts to enjoy. I'm going to share one final tweet from our friend Fred Minnick the other day. Whiskey fans, WhiskyCast is about to hit its 1,000th episode, 15 years of documenting the industry we love. In his archives, you can hear the voices of distillers no longer with us. Congrats, Mark. You're a godsend to all of us whiskey geeks. Thank you, Fred. Now, we had several comments about last week's interview with Raymond Davidson of Glencairn Crystal, including this one from Chris Ratcliffe. Wonderful to hear about the man behind the Glencairn whiskey glass. The best thing about them for me is the cost. I've had free ones, cheap ones, and even bought some direct. I've told friends about them, and they expect something to add to the tasting experience to be 30 to 40 pounds a glass. To do it for £6 at retail is a wonderful example of the right product at the right price, and as Mark says, it has become emblematic of whiskey itself. Thanks for sharing that, Chris, and if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, look for me in the WhiskyCast community app. It's free to download from the Apple and Google app stores. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at WhiskyCast, and my email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. I want to expand on last week's discussion about saponification. That's the process by which whiskey can develop a soapy mouthfeel when water is added too quickly during the proofing process. Basically, that causes the esters in a whiskey to convert into fatty acid salts that give a whiskey that nasty, soapy character. Canuck Sloth posted this comment in the WhiskyCast community app the other day. At the end of this week's WhiskyCast episode, Mark mentioned about soapy texture and flavor in whiskey caused by adding water too fast before bottling. I'm curious if this issue can also happen when adding ice and it melts fast. Well, my understanding is that it would not happen unless you let that whiskey sit for a very long time, and you'd be more likely to drown a whiskey by adding too much water to it than for saponification to occur. Keep in mind that when water is added to reduce a whiskey from cask strength down to bottling strength, that whiskey is then going to sit in a bottle for a long time, and that's when the process of saponification occurs. You're also much more likely to damage a whiskey by adding ice, depending on how that ice was made and stored. If you're using filtered water in a refrigerator's ice maker, you're probably okay. But if you're using tap water and ice cube trays, the ice can pick up flavors from the water or even the food that's stored in your freezer. Think of something fishy or garlicky that's in your freezer that you can smell when you open the door. Hope that answers the question. Thanks to Canuck Sloth for asking it. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot. an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this special edition of WhiskyCast. Thanks again to each and every one of you for listening over the years, and thanks again also to our sponsors, past and present. I've often said I have the best job in the world, but it wouldn't be possible without all of you, or my family. Thanks especially to my partner, Christina Filburn, who was responsible for creating the WhiskyCast community app. You can get in touch with us there, or on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Friends, it's me again, reminding you to try Dewar's French Cask Smooth Blended Scotch Whisky. The best of two cultures and traditions in one beautiful bottle. Please drink responsibly.
And now, a message from Robin Redbreast.
So, in Spain, they call Redbreast Petit Roco. It's me, but a touch more exotic. Kind of like a Redbreast PX edition. Finished in Pedro Jimenez casks, adding a velvety and decadent dimension. You know, I won't lie. A climate like this makes me wish I was a migratory bird.
Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast. Redbreast. Pass it on.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2023, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thank you for listening.